showing off. Don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight. Better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight. Won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me?
All right. Hello. Good evening, everybody. Time for another chapter from The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture. David Bryan Davis, winner of the Pulitzer Prize 1967. Been a fantastic book so far. So we're up to chapter 4 tonight. And I am really enjoying it. It's been great. Unfortunately, the font is so small, or that I have to wear cheaters in order to read it. So that's the problem with getting a little bit older. The eyes are not so good no more. All right, so here we go. I will have to make frequent stops to sip water, but here we go. We'll jump into it. Chapter 4, The Response to Slavery in Medieval and Early Modern Thought. As slavery all but disappeared from most parts of Europe, and as discussions of the institution became increasingly theoretical, one might expect to find the Church turning away from its compromises with the Roman world and using its great moral power to hasten a seemingly beneficial change. It is true that for many centuries bishops, popes, churches, and monasteries continued to own slaves, but the reforms demanded by the Cluniac order and Pope Gregory VII in the 10th and 11th centuries challenged more vital customs and interests of the clergy. How then can we account for an almost universal acceptance of the principle of slavery in areas where the institution had become virtually extinct? Why did the rationalizations of the early church fathers, who had been forced to adjust their thinking to the realities of the Roman world, exert a profound influence on European attitudes toward slavery for more than a millennium? The most plausible explanation would seem to lie in the complex network of mental associations derived from antiquity, which connected slavery with ideas of sin, subordination, and the divine order of the world. To question the ethical basis of slavery, even when the institution was disappearing from view, would be to question fundamental conceptions of God's purpose and man's history and destiny. If slavery were an evil and performed no divinely appointed function, then why had God authorized it in Scripture and permitted it to exist in nearly every nation? If slavery violated the national law of equality and the divine law of human brotherhood, could not the same be said of the family, private property, social orders, and government? And if Christianity gave men the freedom to abolish one worldly institution, did this mean they were cleansed of the last stain of sin and might achieve perfection and happiness on earth by throwing off all secular controls? The continuing appearance of certain heretical sects made it clear that Christianity embodied ideas of liberation and perfection that were potentially explosive when torn from their protective casings and ignited in the charged atmosphere of class rivalry and discontent. The most powerful ideological force for containing and harnessing these dynamic ideals was the doctrine of original sin, which, as we have seen, had become closely connected with slavery. There were times when this linkage seemed to point toward freedom. In the 6th century, after the barbarian invasions had reduced many Christians to slavery, St. Gregory the Great reasoned that since the purpose of the Incarnation had been to liberate man from his bondage to sin and restore him to his original liberty, it was fitting for masters to emancipate slaves who had been born free and enslaved only by the law of nations. This recommendation was no doubt consistent with the church's efforts to infuse a spirit of charity in the hearts of kings and masters, and to protect the right of slaves to marry and to enjoy rest on holy days. But the analogy, if consistently pursued as a basis for action, might become revolutionary. Some 2 centuries later, for example, Archbishop Agobard is supposed to have said it was the duty of any slave or serf to acquire his natural liberty if he were able to do so, which would seem to imply that the slave, like the sinner, had some responsibility for his own deliverance. Abbot Smaragdus not only deemed manumission a meritorious work, but made a bold appeal to Charlemagne, or to his son Louis the Pious, to prohibit his subjects from enslaving one another. In 960, the Patriarch and other bishops of Venice pointed to the tribulations that the city had suffered in former times because of its sin in selling slaves, and attempted to win divine forgiveness by prohibiting residents of the city from engaging in the nefarious trade. 800 years later, the same argument would be heard in Boston, Massachusetts. A collection of such isolated pleas for liberty might lead us to suppose that an incipient stream of anti-slavery thought flowed alongside a pro-slavery stream deriving from Augustine and Aristotle. But while there can be no question that servitude was frequently a source of tension and uneasiness, it would be a mistake to superimpose the divisions of the 19th century on earlier history. Augustine urged masters to treat their slaves as brothers in Christ, and there is no indication that Gregory the Great or Smaragdus attacked the ethical basis of slavery. The variations in early Christian opinion on servitude fit comfortably within a framework of thought that would exclude any attempt to abolish slavery as an institution. Insofar as the Church upheld the belief that men shared a common origin and were free and equal in their natural state, it promoted laws and regulations that acknowledged the bondsman's humanity. The canonists, for example, ruled that a marriage could be legitimate between a male slave and a free woman. Despite his lowly station, the slave retained some irreducible vestige from that state of nature which had antedated sin in society. And even in the fallen world, the Christian master could give evidence of his own charity and humility by showing kindness to individual slaves, who could thus become instruments for his own salvation. But such an impulse toward benevolent action was balanced and kept in check by the two views of God and creation which medieval theology sought to reconcile. When the world was conceived as evil and its values illusory, and opposed to the highest and only good, which was God, then man's destiny could lie only in transcending himself and the world. In finding union with the One, in this view, the only true slaves would be slaves of the flesh. But then God was conceived as a creative force whose goodness was exemplified by the plenitude and harmony of his creation. And when the varieties of being were perceived as a progressive hierarchy of types, each fulfilling a possibility and function, then every institution would have an eternal place in the ordered and purposeful structure of the universe. A concerted attack on the institution of slavery would be most likely to appear only when men's yearning to cross the gulf from finite reality to an infinite good was combined with an interest that endowed this world with primary value. But it was the distinctive characteristic of medieval theology to justify the existing world while providing the means for escaping from it. No one would expect to find abolitionism in the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. Recalling the examples of Plato and Aristotle, we might even suspect that the greatest philosophers have been more inclined than less systemic thinkers to find a reason and purpose for slavery. With St. Thomas, at any rate, the contradiction of thinking of man as a thing was rationalized within a monumental system of ascending stages in which every type of being and relationship had its own place and end. At times, Aquinas suggested that the principle of slavery was part of the governing pattern of nature. He agreed with Aristotle that the principles of despotic and constitutional rule were exemplified in the human faculties. Thus, the intellect governed the appetites by a quote unquote politic power. But the soul's relation to the body was like that of master to slave. Yet Aquinas noted that St. Gregory, among others, had said that slavery was contrary to nature. To deny this judgment was, as Aristotle had done, would tend to invalidate the Stoic concept of man's original liberty under natural law, which had become essential in explaining his fall from grace and need for redemption. If slavery were a positive good and a necessary part of creation, the same might be said of sin itself. It would then become impossible to preserve a sharp distinction between ideal and reality, and one might conclude not only that the existing world was the best of all possible worlds, but that the Creator was indistinguishable from his creation. St. Thomas avoided this danger by insisting that slavery could not have been present in man's original state. It could not be the true good of any man, since a true good must be desired, and no one would desire slavery, which necessarily inflicts pain by depriving man of the power of disposing of himself. But the use of this hedonistic standard did not mean that St. Thomas agreed with the Stoics and early Christians who said that men in the state of nature had lived in perfect liberty and equality. Even the angels in heaven were subjected to a hierarchical pattern of rule and authority based on intrinsic differences in merit. Thus, despite the fall of man, the contrast between the state of nature and the existing social order was not disturbingly great. The difference between slavery and natural subordination was more of degree than of kind. Degree than of kind, okay. This belief made it easier for St. Thomas to reconcile slavery with natural law without relying entirely on the doctrine of original sin. The canonists maintained that even in man's fallen state, no institution could be valid if it violated the law of nature. Roman jurists had ruled unmistakably that slavery was contrary to the jus naturale, and in general Christianity had accepted this view. Yet the canon law itself sanctioned slavery. Bishops, for example, were not allowed to manumit slaves owned by a church unless they made up the loss from their own property. Anathema was pronounced upon anyone who incited slaves to escape or to defy their masters. The canonists attempted to explain this apparent contradiction by arguing that sin had made it necessary to disobey certain demonstrations of natural law, as opposed to explicit commands or prohibitions, in order to carry out the true intentions of the law. In other words, slavery was consistent with that part of the natural law which was still applicable to sinful man. In Aquinas' terms, it was contrary only to the first intention of nature, but not to the second intention, which was adjusted to man's limited capacities. He compared bondage with the impediment of old age. Although the first intention of nature would be to preserve the perfection of each being forever, this was impossible in the world that exists, and accordingly the second intention of nature was to preserve being in successive generations. Like the physical degeneration of old age, slavery was a useful and necessary, if somewhat painful, means of fulfilling the purposes of nature. It was agreeable to man's natural reason, which determined the specific meaning and consequences of natural law in the world of nations. St. Thomas still thought of slavery as occasioned by sin, but he made it seem more natural and tolerable by identifying it with the rational structure of being, which required each individual to accept, along with old age and death, the necessity of subordination to higher authority. This tendency brought him perilously close to a belief in the natural inferiority of slaves. To be sure, he upheld the view that, quote, a slave is his master's chattel in matters superadded to, to nature, but in natural things all are equal, end quote. But rather different conclusions might be drawn from Aquinas' attempt to reconcile the Roman rule of partus sequitur ventrum with the scholastic notions of form and substance. It was accepted doctrine that in physical generation the father supplied the form and the mother provided the matter, and since the being of a thing depended primarily on its form, how could it be held that the son of a free man and a bondwoman should be a slave? Quote, we observe, answered St. Thomas, that in animals born from different species the offspring follows the mother rather than the father. Wherefore mules born of a mare and an ass are more like mares than those born of a she-ass and a horse. Therefore it should be the same with men. End quote. Moreover, the woman's womb had the same relation to a man's seed as a plot of land to a sower. Hence the owner of the woman, like the owner of the land, had claim to all produce. Finally, bondage was a condition of the body, and since the mother provided the substance of the body, it was she who transmitted the condition of slavery. While these arguments did not add up to a theory of inherent inferiority, it is not surprising that Aquinas' followers, Ptolemy of Lucca and especially Aedigius Colonna, appeared to accept the Aristotelian view that some men were slaves by nature. It is interesting to find this belief strongly implied in the eccentric Mirror of Justices, which is thought to have been written or edited in the late 13th century by Andrew Horne, Chamberlain of London. Contrary to all legal precedent, Horne advanced the radical doctrine that there could be no right of prescription against free blood. To keep a man of free ancestry as a slave was a personal trespass. Pause. Sip. Was a personal trespass. Yet, quote, serfage in the case of a man is a subjection issuing from so high an antiquity that no free stock can be found within human memory, and this serfage, according to some, comes from the curse which Noah pronounced against Canaan. Canaan. I don't know why I can't pronounce that. It's anyway, the son of his son Ham, and against his issue, or according to others, from the Philistines. And thus are men serfs by divine law, and this is accepted by human law and confirmed by canon law. End quote. Horne sharply differentiated serfs from villeins, although his distinction was unknown in English law and practice. Villeins he regarded as essentially free men protected by law, while serfs, quote, do not know in the evening what service they will do in the morning, and there is nothing certain in their services. The lords may put them in fetters and in the stocks, may imprison, beat, and chastise them at will, saving their lives and limbs. End quote. It is clear he associated serfdom with the slavery of infidels, who had been captured or purchased beyond the Grecian Sea, whereas Gentile Christians were descended from Shem and Japheth. Serfs were the son of Ham, quote, whom the Christians can give and sell like their other chattels. End quote. This separate ancestry could not, of course, be kept distinct, but for all his bias in favor of freedom, Horne thought servile blood carried a nearly indelible stain. Quote, they are serfs who are engendered by a serf and born of a serf, and whether they be born in or out of wedlock, and one who is begotten by a serf and born of a free woman in wedlock is a serf, and one who is begotten of a free man but born of a bondwoman out of wedlock is a serf. End quote. Since medieval Christianity accepted slavery in principle, the questions of controversy were largely of a practical nature. The most ominous of these pertained to infidels and the effects of baptism. Had all masters and slaves been faithful Christians, the Church could have arrived at a simple and consistent position. The early Church Fathers had ruled that baptism had no effect on the status of a slave, and that a slave must be manumitted before being admitted to orders. In general, the canonists endorsed this traditional stand and held that a slave or serf who had been ordained, because his status was unknown, must be returned to his master. But what should be the status of a baptized slave owned by an infidel living in a Christian land? If he remained a slave, his faith might be corrupted by his unbelieving master, but if he were freed by the mere fact of baptism, the security of all slave property might be endangered. A tradition that baptism automatically liberated the slave of a Jew or heretic found sanction in the canon law, the Third Lateran Council, and the Code de Tortosa. A Jew might keep his slaves, of course, by accepting baptism himself, yet it was obvious that the official policy, if rigorously enforced, might have the effect of impeding conversions. Archbishop Agobard implied that some of the clergy had denied baptism to the pagan slaves of Jews on the ground that baptism would lead to freedom. Such hesitancy Agobard condemned as impious. He reminded the clergy of the brotherhood and natural equality of man. But Louis the Pious found it convenient to make various concessions to Jewish slave owners, and some 4 centuries later St. Thomas gave expediency a philosophical justification. Ideally, he admitted unbelievers should not have dominion over the faithful, but the distinction between unbelievers and the faithful was derived from divine law, which did not abrogate dominion established by natural reason as it worked through human law. Hence, the authority of Jewish masters was legitimate. The principle of slavery was secure. The Church, carrying the authority of God and mediating between the divine law and the sinful world, could of course prohibit infidels from possessing Christian slaves, if such a policy seemed to promote the cause of religion. The Church had decreed that a Jew might purchase Christian slaves for trade, so long as they were sold within a period of 3 months. Otherwise, the bondsmen were to be released without compensation to the owner. St. Thomas noted, however, that in the interest of spreading the faith, the Church had made no attempt to enforce such laws against unbelievers who were not subject to her temporal authority. A contrary course might give Christianity a bad name. During the 14th and 15th centuries, the Church became more militant in its efforts to keep Christians from becoming the slaves of infidels. 2 popes accused the Genoese slave traders of contributing to the powers of the unbelievers. In 1425, a papal bull threatened Christian slave dealers with excommunication and ordered Jews to wear a badge of infamy on their clothing, in part to prevent them from buying Christians. But merchants who handled thousands of slaves paid little attention to the religion or origin of their commodities, and in the Black Sea trade, the Christian slave who was seized or purchased from a Jewish master was simply sold to a man who professed to share his faith. Nevertheless, by the 15th century, Europeans had become increasingly prejudiced against the enslavement of men from Christian countries. The Church denounced and threatened to punish her subjects who kidnapped or forcibly enslaved their fellow Christians. These scruples, however, did not extend to unbelievers, who were usually thought to be undeserving of freedom. When Europeans seized or purchased infidels, they saw themselves as dealing a blow to infidelity in general, as well as procuring new souls for the church to win. These were the assumptions that guided the church when Europeans first came into contact with Negro Africa. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V authorized the King of Portugal to deprive Moors and pagans of their liberty. In 1488, Pope Innocent VIII accepted a gift of 100 Moors from Ferdinand of Spain and distributed them among the cardinals and nobility. But if slavery was thought of both as a weapon for extending Christianity and as a deserved punishment for pagans and heretics, what was the fate of the Turk or Moor who accepted the true faith? Should such a convert be put on equal footing with men born in Christian countries? Did not baptism cleanse him of sin and endow him with at least a capacity for freedom? Franco Sacchetti, in his Sermoni Evangelici, uh, went so far as to say that the baptism of slaves was no more valid than the baptism of oxen, for a slave was utterly lacking in free will. Lest someone conclude that this was an excuse for manumission, Sacchetti hastened to say that freedom would only lead the ex-slave to commit greater sins and could thus never promote his spiritual welfare. Few Christians, however, could accept the harsh implications of an argument that would undercut all belief in the spiritual unity and equality of mankind. In 1366, the priors of Florence, who had previously given their sanction to the import and sale of infidel slaves, explained that by, quote, infidel, quote unquote infidel, they meant, quote, all slaves of infidel origin, even if at the time of their arrival they belonged to the Catholic faith. And infidel origin meant simply from the land and race of the infidels, end quote. With this subtle change in definition, the priors of Florence bypassed the dilemma of baptism by shifting the basis of slavery from religious difference to ethnic origin. It may not be out of place to note the striking similarity between these medieval positions regarding infidels and baptism and certain laws of colonial America which dealt with the same problems. A law of colonial Virginia, for example, ruled that any Christian white servant was automatically free if purchased by a Negro, Indian, Jew, Mohammedan, or other infidel. Yet at least 6 colonies passed acts from 1664 to 1706 proclaiming that unless a man had been a Christian in his native country or had been free in some Christian country before being imported to America, baptism did not affect his status as a slave. The Virginia law of 1682, which was designed to counteract apprehensions similar to these expressed by Franco Sacchetti before the discovery of America, and to encourage the conversion of slaves, quote, born of and in heathenism, idolatrous, pagan, and Mahometan parentage and country, end quote, stated that all servants imported by land or sea, quote, whether Negroes, Moors, mulattoes, or Indians, whose parentage and native country are not Christian at the time of their first purchase by some Christian, though afterwards and before their importation they shall be converted to the Christian faith, shall be adjudged, deemed, and taken to be slaves to all intents and purposes. End quote. As in 14th century Tuscany, conversion to Christianity was to have no effect on the status associated primarily with ethnic origin. The humane provisions of La Siete Partidas the great 13th century codification of law sponsored by Alfonso the Wise, have been seen by some historians as characteristic of the Catholic approach to slavery. Accordingly, the Negro slaves of Latin America have been described as the beneficiaries of a long tradition of legislation designed to make the best of a necessary evil. It is therefore worth asking whether the legislation of medieval Iberia embodied a spirit essentially hostile to chattel slavery, and thus at variance with such authorities as Augustine and Aquinas. Las Siete Partidas followed the Justinian Code in recognizing war, birth, and self-sale as valid grounds for human bondage. The definition of the slaveholder's power echoed ancient Roman law. Quote, "The master has full power over his slave, siervo, to do with him as he wishes. Everything that a slave in any way earns should belong to the master." End quote. But Las Siete Partidas was a theoretical work aimed at synthesizing the best elements of Roman and canon law. It affirmed that by nature men were free and that no master could violate the principles of natural reason. A slave might marry even against his owner's will. If tortured or cruelly treated, he might complain to a judge who could have him sold to a more humane master. Certain provisions increased his chances for manumission. No Jew, Moor, or heretic was to own a Christian slave. It is important to note, however, that as a body of ideal law, Las Siete Partidas had little relation to the living law of Castile. The learned intellectuals who compiled it were under no illusions about the discrepancy between their ideal picture of human bondage and the actual condition of Moorish slaves in Spain, which was, quote, "the most miserable that men could have in this world," end quote. Even in their model law, they drew a sharp distinction between Christian bondsmen and non-Christian captives, and their conception of justice was not altogether humane. The slave who violated a woman of good reputation, or who committed adultery with his master's wife, was to be burned alive. The Code de Tortosa, which was compiled in 1272, about a decade after Las Siete Partidas, prescribed the harshest punishment for slaves and allowed them to appear before a magistrate only when they had a legitimate claim to freedom. A mere chattel in the eyes of the law, the slave could not give testimony in court except in rare instances when it was received by torture, quote, "because what their servants say on such things should not be believed unless they are tormented." End quote. In general, the Spanish law limited the master's punitive power only by denying him the right to kill his slaves. But in Portugal, some 2 centuries later, even such murder was easily absolved under Manueline legislation, which also required death for the slave who struck his owner. While the treatment of Moorish and Negro slaves was probably better than such laws implied, there is no evidence that the legislation of Iberia tended to undermine the institution by curbing the power of masters. In theory, however, medieval Christianity acknowledged the slave's legal and moral capacity for marriage. On this question, the position of St. Thomas was almost identical with that of Las Siete Partidas, and since acceptance of the bondsman's right to marry would seem to imply a repudiation of chattel slavery, it is well to examine the question with some care. Probably no society has attempted to prohibit slaves from having sexual intercourse with members of their own class, or even from living in more or less monogamous or polygamous units. But marriage leads to a contractual relationship of authority and obedience, of reciprocal rights and obligations within a family, which is clearly incompatible with the concept of a master's absolute ownership of his slaves. One should not confuse this basic incompatibility with various restraints that have usually modified even chattel slavery, such as a denial of the master's right to exterminate his living property. In many modern societies, it is against the law to torture domestic animals, and the owners of such property must necessarily make concessions to the temperament and natural instincts of their living possessions. Yet their power of ownership, however limited in practice, is in theory as absolute as the health and safety of the community will permit. This was the kind of power that slave owners were traditionally said to possess. It was a power that could not be divided and given over in part to the slaves without destroying the very concept of slavery. It was for this reason that Roman masters retained full legal ownership of a slave's peculium and that Roman law refused to recognize a slave's capacity for marriage. It was for this reason that canon law prohibited the slave from being ordained, which would require the freedom to accept obligations that would, in effect, nullify a master's authority. The obligations of baptism were spiritual and in no way infringed upon a master's authority. But if at times it was difficult to reconcile slavery even with baptism, how could one begin to reconcile the institution with the tangible loyalties and obligations of marriage? When St. Thomas spoke of the slave as the physical instrument of his owner, who had full claim to everything the slave possessed or produced, including children, he would seem to have ruled out the possibility of marriage. It was, however, a primary goal of Aquinas to locate functional points of accommodation between the claims of nature and the restraints of authority. While the master had nearly absolute power over his slave instrument by virtue of the secondary or relative law of nature, the bondsman was still subject to the primary law of nature insofar as it had not been modified by sin. Slavery, then, was a physical impediment to marriage, comparable to impotence, and the marriage of a slave and free person could be valid only if the latter had knowledge of the impediment, as was the case with impotence. Yet only the marriage rite could sanctify the mating of human beings, which was as natural and inevitable as the mating of animals. Like eating and sleeping, marriage could not be prohibited by a master's authority. By identifying marriage with the natural union of the sexes, Aquinas made it appear outside the range of authority derived from the social needs of a sinful world. But to what extent did the impediment of slavery, as justified by the secondary intent of nature, limit the primary law of conjugal union? How were the sanctified unions of slaves to differ from the casual breeding of livestock? It is at this crucial point that the synthesis of nature and authority appears to weaken. For a slave's right to marry amounts to no more than a right to escape the guilt of fornication unless the unity and integrity of his family are guaranteed. Aquinas assumed that a stable and non-speculative economy would always allow an owner to receive a just price for his slaves, and that therefore no owner should be obliged to separate slave families in a sale. He could not, however, question the owner's right to separate members of a family, since he had accepted the owner's absolute claim to the offspring of female slaves. Thus the slave husband and father had no power to protect his family, and no sphere of authority that might not be invaded by the overriding commands of his master. It is true that an owner who had consented to the marriage of his slaves was bound, in St. Thomas's view, to respect the obligations of the contract. This, of course, would hardly be chattel slavery, but when a slave had married without his master's permission, Aquinas admitted that the commands of the master should ordinarily take precedence over marital duty. No doubt the Catholic recognition of a slave's right to marry represents a moral position considerably in advance of Roman or Protestant American law. In practice, the Church urged masters to consent to such unions and to respect the sanctity of all marriages. But it is also true that the marriage of slaves were often accepted in practice in both ancient Rome and 19th century America, and if the Church's foremost philosopher endowed slave marriages with the high justification of natural law, he was careful to prevent this law from undermining the supreme authority of masters or from modifying the essential character of chattel slavery. In so doing, he deprived slave marriage of its essential meaning. We just want to see. Ooh, we have a ways to go. Oh, this is the end of part 1 of the book. This chapter is. So we're on page 106, and we've got to get to 121. So we got a ways to go. In subsequent chapters, we shall have occasion to discuss Protestant sources of anti-slavery thought, as well as early Catholic protests against the African trade. For our present discussion, however, it is sufficient to note that the Reformation brought no immediate change to the traditional ideas of servitude. When Swabian serfs appealed for emancipation in 1525, holding that Christ had died to set men free, Martin Luther was as horrified as any Orthodox Catholic. Such a total distortion of Scripture would make Christian liberty ganz fleischlich. The peasants' demands would make all men equal and convert Christ's spiritual kingdom into a worldly external thing. As St. Paul had shown, masters and slaves must accept their present stations, for the earthly kingdom could not survive unless some men were free and some were slaves. But if Luther's traditionalism is hardly surprising, we might well expect to find a growing hostility to perpetual bondage in the writings of jurists and humanists of the Renaissance, who took an increasingly secular view of human institutions, and who arrived at an enlarged estimate of man's creative powers and inherent nobility. Such a trend toward liberalism would have been in conformity with the actual erosion of slavery and serfdom in Western Europe. As early as the 14th century, an eminent Italian jurist, Bartolo de Sassoferrato, noted that Europeans had long since abandoned the custom of enslaving one another in war. By 1608, Antoine Lassalle could say that in France all men were free. One might suppose that this progress in the accepted rules of warfare had discredited the leading justification of slavery inherited from the Justinian Code. From the perspective of the 19th century, it would have been only natural if such beneficent changes had been accompanied by stirring protests against human bondage in any form. Yet one could not lightly challenge an institution approved not only by the fathers and canons of the Church, but by the most illustrious writers of antiquity, men who showed increased respect for Plato, Aristotle, and Roman law would not be likely to condemn slavery as an intrinsic evil. Hence the revival of classical learning, which may have helped to liberate the mind of Europe from bondage to ignorance and superstition, only reinforced the traditional justifications for human slavery. Consider, for example, the Utopia of Thomas More. Because More permitted both war and slavery in his imaginary society, scholars have long debated whether he proposed an ideal of true social perfection. Certainly More was bold enough to criticize many injustices, such as enclosure and a barbarous penal code. If he felt that men could never achieve absolute perfection on earth, he suggested that natural reason could create a society in which the individual and common good would merge to produce the maximum possible happiness. In the words of R.P. Adams, his utopia offered, quote, a concrete vision of a good life perhaps attainable, end quote. And yet he would allow the vile drudge, who was a, quote, a poor laborer in a other country, end quote, to become a bondsman in Utopia. Persons convicted of atrocious crimes would be excommunicated from society and would be enslaved. Quote, for there cometh more profit of their labor than of their death. End quote. Like later Americans, More showed faith in the criminal justice of less perfect countries, since Utopia's slaves would include those who, quote, in the cities of other lands for great trespasses be condemned to death, end quote. And while the foreign perpetrators of war would be killed, their troops would be captured and enslaved. The stigma of bondage would not be passed on to subsequent generations, but the fact remains that More embraced a fully developed slave system. In part, this was a logical extension of his sharp dichotomy between the children of virtue and the criminals and aliens who refused to live by the highest standards of reason. But it was also a reflection of his dependence upon previous thinkers such as Duns Scotus, Plato, and the Stoics. The problem of slavery in Utopia is put in better perspective when we note that no protest against the traditional theory emerged from the great 17th century authorities on law or from such philosophers and men of letters as Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, Pascal, Bayle, or Fontenelle. But the fact that slavery had declined in Europe and yet was being revived in a deadly form in America gave a peculiarly abstract character to discussions governed by the Justinian Code. Throughout Europe, scholars debated the relation of slavery to divine and natural law as an exercise in dialectic. It was as if the learned volumes on law and statecraft had been produced in a different world from that which contained the Negro captives awaiting shipment at Elmina Castle, the disease and sickening stench of the slave ships, and the regimented labor of colonial plantations. Even in 16th century Spain, the theories of such imposing figures as Covarrubias and Luis Molina regarding legal enslavement of prisoners of war had little relevance to the actual slaving raids of African chieftains. The inherent contradiction of human slavery had always generated dualisms in thought, but by the 16th and 17th centuries, Europeans had arrived at the great dualism of all, the greatest dualism of all, the monumentous division between an increasing devotion to liberty in Europe and an expanding mercantile system based on Negro labor in America. For a time, most jurists and philosophers met this discrepancy simply by ignoring it, and by adhering to classical theories of slavery that were thought to have universal application. Nevertheless, the polarities of geography and race were matched by a widening division in the jurisprudence of slavery, which arose from changing attitudes toward natural law. Traditionally, philosophers had assumed a direct correspondence between human institutions, the law of nations, and the fundamental rules of equity as established by nature and right reason. Jurists searched for the concrete applications of a law that was at once transcendent and written on the hearts or in the consciences of men. In the 15th century, Bartolomeo Coppola Coppola uh, could assume that slavery was authorized not only by civil law and the jus gentium, but by natural and divine law as well. But increasingly there was a weakening of the link of relative natural law that had connected the world of human institutions with the ideal realm of nature. This was particularly true in Protestantism. Luther's profound separation of inner liberty from outward obedience to established authority transformed every subject into a divided being who resembled to some extent the Stoic picture of the slave. For Melanchthon Melanchthon, as for the Stoics, there was no I don't know why I couldn't read that. Incompatibility between bondage and true liberty. By shifting the ground of religion from meritorious works to an inward faith, Protestantism moved away from the idea of an organic society in which rights and duties were intricately balanced and tended to free worldly authority from the restraints of natural law. But even Francisco Suarez, who followed St. Thomas in many respects, accepted a sharp dualism between the eternal law of nature and the law of nations, governed by expediency and conditioned by circumstance. Slavery, like private property, could not be justified by the highest moral law, yet its expediency had been revealed by the almost universal practice of nations. According to Suarez, it was unnecessary that an institution sanctioned by utility and common practice be shown as conformable to the absolute ideal of nature. Similarly, when the Protestant Pierre Giroux used the traditional Christian argument that slavery, though a consequence of sin, was contrary to nature, Jacques Bousset based his reply on the practical ground that one could not reject the institution without rejecting both war and the law of nations. Citing slavery as an example of a dominion unlimited by compact, Bousset argued that all authority, regardless of its origin, became legitimate with time and common acceptance. Anarchy was the worst of all evils, for it made everyone both master and slave, and if slavery was often seen as a necessary instrument for discipline and secular statecraft, needing no further sanction of natural or divine law, circumstances might justify it in one country and not in another. Francois Delaunay, whom Louis XIV appointed to the chair of French law at Paris, could affirm that colonial slavery was in no way contrary to Christianity, and yet take satisfaction from the fact that in France all men were free. The inclination to discuss slavery as a matter of public policy was of course strengthened in the 17th century when the slave trade and colonial plantations became increasingly important in the international contest for economic and military power. As attention shifted from original sin and natural rights to more practical questions of national self-interest and the best means of procuring and governing a colonial labor force, the moral grounds of slavery receded from view. We shall treat these questions in some detail later on, but first we need to ask whether the trends in secular political thought at the highest level provided an intellectual basis for challenging the decisions of judges and statesmen and for demanding a reversal in the policy of nations. That Jean Bodin, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, should know a marked hostility to human bondage, should show a marked hostility to human bondage, and originate what may properly be called an anti-slavery philosophy, presents a perplexing problem. His mind was medieval enough to be obsessed with witches and demons. He so exalted the rights of private property that he would require the consent of owners to all taxation. He would give to fathers, in the interest of proper discipline, the right of life and death over their children. But of all Renaissance political thinkers, he was in some ways the most original and modern. He did much to create the idea of sovereignty as a supreme political authority which responds to change by constructive legislation. His views on slavery were no more anomalous than were his views on the state, and in the last analysis must be regarded as the product of a uniquely independent mind. Bodin's mind, however, did not work in a historical vacuum. Apparently, while he was a student of civil law at the University of Toulouse, a Genoese merchant visited the province with a slave. When the merchant's host persuaded the slave to demand his freedom, the magistrates discovered records proving that any slave who entered Toulouse was automatically free. The merchant, who was on his way from Spain to Genoa, could not see why he should be bound by French law, but he reluctantly manumitted his slave after making a contract for lifetime service. Bodin was impressed by the incident and used it as evidence that the laws of France did not permit slavery, and for Bodin such legal precedent was vaguely associated with a higher law which guided and limited even the sovereign, free as he might be from all human authority. We should note that in the 1570s, when the Republic was written, France had not yet committed herself to the slave trade, and a supporter of Henry III would not lose favor by exposing the barbarity of the Spanish. Bodin's religious unorthodoxy, which verged on Protestantism, had caused him to be imprisoned for a year and a half. In an age of the cruelest religious warfare, he looked to an all-powerful sovereign as the best means for fashioning a rational social order. If his independence of mind and religious unorthodoxy equipped him to perceive the injustice of widely accepted institutions, he did not arrive at his anti-slavery position through a belief in the natural equality of mankind. His chief disciple in England was not John Locke, but Sir Robert Filmer. For Bodin, it was unthinkable that any group of men, no matter how base or degraded, should be excluded from the body politic, and thus deprived of being subjects of an absolute sovereign. His concept of an organic state would not permit the dualism of slavery and freedom. One of his analogies was given heightened significance by the traditional association between slaves and sex. Quote, "There be in man's body," he discreetly suggested, "some members, I may not call them filthy, for that nothing can so be which is natural, but yet so shameful as that no man, except he be past all shame, can without blushing reveal or discover the same. And do they for that cease to be members of the whole body?" End quote. But what of the opinions of philosophers and the precedents of antiquity? Bodin took obvious delight in assaulting Aristotle and the entire tradition of scholastic reasoning, and his key weapon in this demolition was the logic of Petrus Ramus. The disciples of Ramus assumed that truth, which was eternal but frequently obscured by fallacious reasoning, could be revealed most simply and directly by reducing a question to one or more dichotomies, and discarding those parts which seemed to violate common sense. As applied to the problem of slavery, the process appears obviously simple, but it represented a radical departure from the traditional discussions of natural law and the law of nations. Bodin was content to summarize arguments for and against slavery, and to ask which of the two was the better. In each argument, the final test was expediency and common sense. Hence, the Aristotelian case for natural slavery would hold only if the brutal, rich, and ignorant obeyed the wise, prudent, and humble. The Augustinian theory of slavery was as punishment for sin would be valid only if masters were agents of the divine will and invariably obeyed God's laws. The provisions of the Jus Gentium for enslaving prisoners of war were impractical as well as inhumane, for it was no charity to spare a man's life only to exploit his labor, and if examples were wanted to deter future aggressors, it would be more effective to kill all captives. The appeal to precedent and to the common practice of nations was groundless, since every kind of wickedness, including human sacrifice, had been regarded as virtuous at some time in history. Of cardinal importance was Bodin's belief that mankind could err through centuries in both thought and practice, but that social and political truths were knowable if one used the correct process of reasoning. While this implied a rejection of historical precedent, the grave man the grave men of his case against slavery, the gravamen of his case against slavery rested on historical evidence. With great learning, he showed that slavery had always brought cruelty, corruption, conspiracy, and rebellion. Even the mitigating regulation of Jews, Muslims, and Christians had seldom been observed. It was a catastrophe that slavery had ever been introduced into the world, let alone reintroduced into America after Europe had progressed so long toward freedom. Yet bondage seemed to be creeping back into the continent from its outer boundaries. The Tartars had enslaved many Christians in Eastern Europe. Bondsmen had appeared again in Italy. In Spain and Portugal, they were openly sold as if they were beasts. Though Bodin placed considerable blame on the later two countries, he did not really explain how this retrogression had come about. He implied that it was simply the result of a spirit of boldness and insubordination which could not be controlled even by benevolent monarchs like Charles V. Bodin was more interested in positive legislation that would prevent slavery from spreading across Europe, or that would modify it for the good of the Commonwealth. The wise legislator who could anticipate problems would destroy a possible source of bondage by providing public houses where the poor could learn useful trades. In nations where slavery already existed, it could best be eradicated by a very gradual process of emancipation, quote, having before their enfranchisement taught them some occupation whereby to relieve themselves, end quote. Unless they were strangers, by which Bodin apparently meant men of different nationality, the liberated slaves should become full citizens. To many ears, these cautious arguments and proposals would still sound radical after some 2 centuries had passed. Hey there, Nambro. How's it going? Thank you for stopping in. If Bodin has often been pictured as a defender of the absolute power and hence as an enemy of freedom, Hugo Grotius has been classed as a liberal humanist who, along with Jacobus Arminius, helped free the human will from a theoretical bondage imposed by Augustine and revived by Calvin. It was Grotius who also loosened natural law from the confining web of theology and raised it as a supreme authority above not only the will of every earthly sovereign, but above the will of God. Ernst Cassirer has said that Grotius accomplished for law what Galileo did for natural science. By making law independent of both divine revelation and the transitory conditions of life, and thus autonomous and self-evident as mathematics, he created a standard which might at once bind the capricious will of tyrants and help shape the world of men into a more rational and purposeful order. But did this transcendent law, revealed to man by natural reason, secularized by its divorce from the doctrine of sin, necessarily exclude the practice of slavery? Was it legal for Dutch captains sailing in increasing numbers while Grotius wrote, to purchase negroes on the coast of Africa and transport them to the New World? Here we arrive at a seeming paradox. Where Bodin would use the will of the sovereign to abolish slavery in the most expedient fashion, Grotius, who would subordinate all sovereign power to the rules of reason, saw slavery as harmonious with natural justice. His intimate knowledge of classical authorities would be used to create a secular philosophy of law and constitutional power, but it could also be turned to a secular defense of slavery at a time when the prosperity of Holland was closely linked to the African trade. What do we got? I have pizza and I have beer and I have come to lend an ear. Well, thank you for that. We went for a mountain bike ride earlier tonight and then had a burger at the bar and then had to ride back to work it off. So, all right. Few of his contemporaries could have possessed so wide a knowledge of the history of slavery. His discussion was studded with references to the views of Aristotle, Philemon, Seneca, St. Paul, Gaius, Alpion, Augustine, and Clement of Alexandria. He gave lip service to the traditional belief that slavery, being unknown in man's primeval state, was not a product of nature. But Grotius made no attempt to bridge the gap between slavery and nature by appealing to original sin or to man's fall from a better condition. For how could an institution supported by so many authorities and sanctioned by the general custom of nations be intrinsically unjust or repugnant to natural reason? In attempting to construct a rational and secular defense of slavery, Grotius betrayed at moments a profound uncertainty. If one chose as a criterion the actual practice of nations, he must conclude that the subjects of an enemy could be enslaved even when they had committed no delict. Um, the utility of slavery as a means of sparing the lives of prisoners seemed self-evident. A soldier would be more likely to preserve the life of a captive if he knew that he could later sell such property or claim the progeny that would never have been born had he killed a female prisoner. Yet Grotius had to admit that Christians and Moslems did not enslave members of their own faiths. The example of Christians in ransoming captives showed that slavery was not always necessary to prevent wholesale slaughter. Grotius appeared to feel more confident in arguing that masters who provided sustenance to the children of slaves had a right to their perpetual service. There could be nothing shocking, he said, about such an exchange of bondage for a perpetual certainty of food. Parents, after all, had a natural right to sell children who could be provided for in no other way. But it was precisely when Grotius turned to the rights of masters that his assumed harmony between general custom and natural reason broke down. The custom of endowing a master with absolute power could be justified on the utilitarian ground that a more limited power might not have been sufficient inducement for sparing the life of the original captive. Yet absolute power was repugnant to Grotius's entire philosophy of law, and accordingly he drew a distinction between external right derived from utility and intrinsic justice as revealed by natural reason. And since a slave owner might have a legal right to do that which was intrinsically unjust, there were certain limits to the slave's duty of obedience. It was Grotius's quote-unquote probable opinion that it was lawful for a slave subjected to extreme cruelty to seek refuge in flight. Similarly, the slave, or the descendant of a slave, who had been unjustly captured, would not be morally guilty of theft if he should escape, provided that he did not owe anything to his master. Have a sip here. Despite these reservations, which were necessary to preserve the supremacy, what's that? Okay. Despite these reservations, which were necessary to preserve the supremacy of a higher law, Grotius tended to associate slavery with the entire fabric of social discipline and authority. Without reference to original sin, he quoted Augustine on the necessity of people bearing with their princes and of slaves submitting to their masters. The most telling reason why slaves could not disobey or resist their masters was that the latter's external rights, though originating in utility and only permitted by natural reason, were protected and supported by judicial tribunals. Thus, to resist the master was to challenge the authority of the magistrate, while Grotius to helped to free the subject of slavery from the doctrine of original sin. He saw it as an integral part of a system of authority and discipline that was an expression of the world's rational order. The lingering uncertainties which Grotius felt over intrinsic justice and external right disappear entirely in the writings of Thomas Hobbes. For Hobbes, slavery was an inevitable part of the logic of power. It raised no questions of sin or natural inferiority, except in the sense that all authority rested on a natural force restraining man from his anarchic and aggressive individualism. While Hobbes retained the traditional view that slavery was a component in the world's system of subordination and authority, he felt no sense of tension between this worldly state of obedience and discipline and an ideal state of natural freedom. He also abandoned completely the Stoic and Christian distinction between external bondage of the flesh and internal liberty of the soul. Indeed, for Hobbes, the slave's will was so utterly subordinated to that of his master that he could only will whatever his master willed. It was therefore impossible for an owner to do injury to his slave. It is true that Hobbes recognized, as had Dio Chrysostom many centuries before, that when a man was captured in war, there was nothing to prevent him from attempting to escape or from continuing the war by trying to kill his captor. Presumably, such a prisoner would be physically bound, which for Hobbes was the only true meaning of deprivation of liberty. Up to this point, the relation of captor to captive was purely one of physical power, but when the bonds were broken and the prisoner accepted obedience in return for corporal freedom, the dominion of the master was sanctioned by compact. This model of slave making resembled in many respects Hobbes's concept of the social compact. Hobbes stated quite explicitly that the only difference between the free subject and the servant was that one served the city and the other served a fellow subject. Hence the servant had no cause to complain of oppression or lack of liberty when he was only kept from hurting himself and was provided with sustenance in exchange for being governed. By compact, however, Hobbes did not imply reciprocal rights and obligations. The servant had no rights whatsoever and was obliged to obey every command of his lord. For disobedience he might even be killed with impunity. He could be sold or conveyed as his master wished. Since the time of Plato and Aristotle, there had been few justifications of such unmitigated power of one man over another. Nevertheless, it was precisely thus this unmitigated power that made the compact between master and slave a meaningless fiction, and opened the way for the bondsman's legitimate escape or rebellion. The master could use all the power at his command to prevent such resistance from a slave who felt that continued bondage was not in his own self-interest. But in Hobbes's theory, there was no legal basis for challenging successful revolt. Indeed, in a paradoxical way, Hobbes may be seen as one of the prime sources of anti-slavery thought. By sweeping away traditional distinctions based on supposedly natural merit and wisdom, and by reducing all social relations to fear and self-interest, he undermined both the classical and Christian justifications for human bondage. Insofar as Hobbes linked the defense of slavery with the defense of an absolutist state, departing from the Hellenic distinction between domestic bondage and constitutional government, he also made it easier for future writers to move from an attack on absolutism to an attack on slavery. In France, the same can be said of Bossuet. Bassout. I'm just going to say Bassout. I know that's wrong, but it's easy. Yet Hobbes's views on servitude were adopted, at least in part, by men like Samuel Pufendorf, uh, whose philosophies of natural law and social compact inspired 18th century defenders of liberty. Though Pufendorf did not follow Hobbes to the extreme of maintaining that a master could do no injury to his slave, he agreed that the institution was founded on compact and was in accord with natural law. Moreover, since the majority of men lived by selfish impulse, he thought that slavery was highly useful as an instrument of social discipline, comparable to monogamous marriage or to the coercive functions of the state. Believing that it would reduce the numbers of idlers, thieves, and vagabonds, Puffendorf had no objection to its being revived in Europe. For John Locke, on the other hand, quote, slavery is so vile and miserable in a state of man, and so directly opposite to the generous temper and courage of our nation, that 'tis hardly to be conceived that an Englishman, much less a gentleman, should plead for it. End quote. This ringing challenge was directed to Sir Robert Filmer's contention that all authority was like that of master over slave, and that regal power beginning with Adam was absolute, arbitrary, and unlimited. Yet John Locke, who was certainly an Englishman and a gentleman, had in 1669 transcribed, as Secretary of Lord Ashley, the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, which provided that church membership would have no effect whatever on the status of slaves, and that, quote, every free man of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves, end quote. There is no evidence that he found these provisions objectionable. Indeed, he was to become an investor in the Royal African Company, and clearly regarded Negro slavery as a justifiable institution. 3 more pages. But how can it be that so great a defender of the inalienable rights of man was not at heart a determined enemy of slavery? It was Locke, after all, who sought to free the individual from authority based on revelation, precedent, or sheer might. It was Locke who held that even after an individual had voluntarily subjected himself to the social compact, his fundamental rights should always be protected from, quote, the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man, end quote. It was the very essence of Locke's philosophy of inalienable rights that no man could sell himself to another, and regardless of his station in life, every man in Locke's eyes should have a right to his own person and labor, and to the property which resulted from mixing his labor with nature. Surely this is the very antithesis of pro-slavery views of Puffendorf, Hobbes, and Grotius. Since slavery was so utterly repugnant to the spirit of Locke's social contract, there could be no question of its being justified as a useful or necessary link in society's chain of authority. Okay. But we have already noted the curious capacity of slavery for generating or accommodating itself to dualisms in thought. We have seen that American colonists were not the first to combine a love of political liberty with an acceptance of chattel slavery, and ironically, it was precisely the same opening in Locke's theory of social contract that allowed both the justification of slavery and the preservation of natural rights. For in Locke's view, the origin of slavery, like the origin of liberty and property, was entirely outside the social contract. When any man by fault or act forfeited his life to another, he could not complain of injustice, if his punishment was postponed by his being enslaved. If the hardships of bondage should at any time outweigh the value of life, he could commit suicide by resisting his master and receiving the death which he had all along deserved. Quote, This is the perfect condition of slavery, Locke wrote, which is nothing else but the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. End quote. Hence, the relationship was one in which the obligations of the social compact were entirely suspended. Like the murderer, the slave had abrogated the compact and forfeited his natural rights. But whereas the relatives of the murderer's victim were required to surrender to the state their natural right to retaliation, the continuing war between master and slave carried over into society, and was presumably outside the jurisdiction of the state. Though it may be objected that these views had little subsequent influence, they raise a number of interesting implications. First of all, in Locke's world, men would be either entirely free or entirely slave, and the condition of the latter would not be mitigated by the influence of natural reason or intrinsic justice. The master's authority would be as unlimited as it had been for Hobbes, but even Hobbes thought of slavery as part of the social order and as having at least a form of a compact. In theory, it could be regulated or abolished by the sovereign, but the elemental struggle between two enemies, which Hobbes looked at only took which Hobbes took only as the natural condition which made slavery necessary as a social institution, Locke took as slavery's continuing and essential character. This meant that he had turned the traditional Stoic and Christian conception of slavery upside down, for instead of picturing bondage as a product of sinful society, he found its origins and justification outside the limits of a free and rational society. It followed, though Locke did not press the point, that slavery was in conformity with natural law and was as universally valid as private property. And since slaves were private property and the title of owners was based on natural right, it would presumably be the duty of any state to protect the rights of slaveholders. Locke's entire argument was highly legalistic and abstract. Unlike Bodine and Grotius, he generally ignored historical precedent. Unlike Suarez, he appealed to principle rather than to expediency or the common practice of nations. He wrote as if no one had ever questioned the right to enslave prisoners of war, and whereas servants were subject only to limited and contractual duties, slaves, being captives taken in a just war, are by the right of nature subjected to the absolute dominion and arbitrary power of their masters. Locke assumed that the authority of West Indian planters was like that of the biblical patriarchs, but argued that in both cases dominion derived from the purchase of legitimate captives rather than from the inheritance of divinely instituted rights. Like Hobbes, like Hobbes, oh shit, I lost my place. Sorry. Like Hobbes, Locke narrowed the ground on which slavery could be justified, and obviously his theory of natural liberty could be could become a vital component of abolitionist thought. But his unquestioning acceptance of colonial slavery shows how remote abolitionism was from even the more liberal minds of the late 17th century. We must conclude then that the thought of Grotius, Hobbes, Pufendorf, and Locke, while preparing the way for the secular theories of the Enlightenment, provided little basis for criticizing Europe's policy of supporting and extending slavery in the New World. The ancient Stoic dualism of slavery and nature, which had been embodied in Christian doctrine, might have served as a foundation for anti-slavery, though as soon as anti-slavery thought, as soon as man sought to develop a theory of politics on natural principles. But despite the early lead of Jean Bodine, or Jean Bodine, political thought in the 17th century did not move in the direction of abolitionism. To be sure, the most original minds no longer justified human bondage as the dark fruit of sin, or as a disciplinary force in the divine government of the world. But for Grotius, Hobbes, and Pufendorf, the divine order had been at least partly replaced by a system of law or power in which slavery was a rational and harmonious element. This, after all, was in the great tradition of Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas. For Locke, on the other hand, original sin had been replaced by a supposedly willful act which required that the slave be forever excluded from the paradisial compact and worked in the sweat of his brow for the benefit of others, and from this secular hell there was apparently no redemption. Whew. The last part was a little bit rough, but we got through it. Oh, God, get those things off. And that finishes part one of the book. We get back into part two on Sunday. I think I have my meeting on this Sunday, so I might not be able to read Sunday. Um, I have to check my calendar. It's every other week, every other Sunday. But that would take us into chapter 5, which is called Changing Views on the Value and Dangers of American Slavery. So that is where we'll pick up next reading, whether that's Sunday or Tuesday. Um, we'll find out. I have to check my calendar, like I said. But another very interesting chapter. How people were trying to justify it and being so contradictory in their beliefs. But anyway, that's that for this session. I will leave it off there, and I haven't decided if I want to play, so let's see if there's anybody around to raid. Um, I might come back and play. Mr. Blitzer's playing The Witcher 3. Let's go see him for a little bit. Bear with me just a minute. We'll get on over there. See you there.